Normandy, June 1944. The hedgerow country of the bocage stretches south from the landing beaches in a maze of sunken lanes, earthen walls, and fields so small a man can throw a rock across them. It is beautiful country. It is also killing country. Second Lieutenant Roy Paget is 23 years old. He grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, the son of a coal miner. Before the Army, he'd spent 2 summers surveying road cuts for the State Highway Department, crawling through scrub and red clay with a transit and a rod, learning how terrain lies. Now he holds a different kind of instrument, a long-handled metal detector, a device his regiment calls a mine probe, and a grease pencil for marking cleared ground. He is attached to the 620th Engineer Combat Battalion, and he has been awake for 31 hours. The field in front of him has been seeded with shoe mines, wooden-cased anti-personnel devices that his detector cannot find. The Germans laid them 3 weeks ago, before the breakout, and then they retreated. But they did not retreat far, and the field still has to be crossed. Here is the thing that will define the next 2 years of Roy Paget's war, and the next 2 years of Allied ground operations in Western Europe. The Germans are not losing because they are running out of mines. They are not losing because their minefields are poorly designed. They are losing, in part, because American combat engineers, men like Paget, trained in a doctrine developed between 1942 and 1944 in a series of experiments most histories never mention, are going to find a way to make German minefields destroy themselves. Not by finding every mine, not by mapping every field, by understanding the physics of detonation well enough to turn the enemy's own ordnance against his own defensive positions. What Paget and the engineers around him figured out, and how they figured it out, is one of the most under-examined technical stories of the entire European campaign. To understand it, we need to go back. Not to Normandy, not even to the war. We need to go back to the problem itself, to what a minefield actually is, what it is designed to do, and why the standard Allied approach to defeating it was, by the summer of 1944, killing American soldiers at a rate that the Army's own after-action reports described as unsustainable. Part 1. The Geometry of Fear. To understand what the engineers eventually did, you first have to understand what they were up against. And to understand that, you have to understand what a minefield is not. A minefield is not a barrier. This is the single most important thing to know, and it is the thing that almost every civilian account of mine warfare gets wrong. A minefield, in formal German military doctrine, specifically in the Heeresdienstvorschrift 318, the German Army's mine warfare regulation updated in 1942, is described explicitly as a Feuerverstärkungsmittel, a fire reinforcement measure, not a stopping device, a slowing device designed to hold an enemy in a kill zone long enough for artillery, machine guns, or mortars to do the actual killing. Hold that distinction. The Germans understood this with extraordinary precision. Their standard defensive minefield in Western Europe by 1944 was not a random scattering of explosives. It was a calculated system with 3 interlocking layers. The outer layer used anti-tank mines, typically the Tellermine 35 or the Tellermine 42, circular steel-cased devices weighing between 8 and 9 kilograms, requiring between 90 and 160 kilograms of pressure to detonate. These were laid in patterns designed to channel armored vehicles into specific corridors. The middle layer used anti-personnel mines, shoe mines, S-mines, Regal mines, designed to kill or maim the infantry who dismounted from their vehicles to help the tanks. The inner layer was often a wire obstacle, sometimes electrified, sometimes simply barbed, sometimes mined itself, always covered by direct fire. The whole system was designed to produce one outcome. A column of vehicles stops, infantry dismounts, Infantry enters the minefield to help the vehicles. Infantry starts dying. The entire formation freezes in place, and German artillery kills them all. It worked. In Tunisia, in 1942 and 43, American armor and infantry lost hundreds of men and dozens of vehicles to exactly this sequence. At Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, the Second Corps lost an estimated 380 men killed and more than 3,000 wounded in 72 hours, with German minefields playing a central role in stopping American armored advances cold and holding them in artillery kill zones. The after-action reports from Kasserine are brutal reading. One regimental commander wrote, and this is documented in the National Archives Record Group 407, that his men could not advance, could not withdraw, and could not stand still without casualties. Count those words: could not advance, could not withdraw, could not stand still. That is the minefield doing exactly what the Heeresdienstvorschrift said it should do. The standard American response to a minefield in 1942 was what the field manual called manual breaching. Engineers moved forward on their hands and knees, probing the ground with bayonets or steel rods at 45-degree angles, feeling for resistance that indicated a buried mine. When they found one, they marked it, dug around it carefully, and either disarmed it by removing the fuse or lifted it out of the ground and moved it to the side. A trained two-man team could clear a lane 1 meter wide and 50 meters long in approximately 45 minutes under ideal conditions. Flat terrain, dry soil, no enemy fire. Under combat conditions, with German snipers, mortars, and machine guns covering the minefield, it was different. A two-man team clearing a lane under fire took between 3 and 6 hours, if they survived to finish. The casualty rate among breaching teams in Tunisia was documented at approximately 31% per operation, meaning roughly 1 in 3 men who went into a minefield to clear it by hand did not come out on their own 2 feet. 31%. Hold that number. The Army knew the manual method was inadequate before the end of 1943. What it did not yet know was how to replace it. That problem was handed to a group of men who were, by training, the least glamorous soldiers in the United States Army: combat engineers, men who built bridges and cleared roads and laid their own minefields, and were expected, when necessary, to unmake the enemies. The solution they developed was not elegant, it was not quick. It emerged from a series of experiments conducted between late 1943 and mid-1944 at several locations, including the Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and in the field in North Africa and then Italy. And it began with a question that sounds almost too simple to be the foundation of a military doctrine. What if you did not clear the minefield? What if instead you made it go off? Part 2. The men who asked the wrong question. The name that appears most consistently in the primary documentation of American mine warfare development in this period is Colonel John T. O'Brien. Not a famous name. Not a name that appears in popular histories of the European campaign. O'Brien was the chief of the mine warfare section of the Army's Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir from 1943 to 1945, and the records of his section, now held in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, run to several thousand pages of test reports, field evaluations, and correspondence with theater commanders. O'Brien was 41 years old in 1943. He was from Butte, Montana, the son of a copper smelter foreman. He had a degree in civil engineering from the University of Montana and had spent the 1930s working on dam construction projects in the Pacific Northwest. He was commissioned in the Corps of Engineers as a reserve officer in 1938, activated in 1941, and arrived at Fort Belvoir in the spring of 1943 with a mandate from the Chief of Engineers that was, in the language of the memo authorizing his section, to develop and evaluate methods of mine neutralization suitable for employment by combat engineers under fire. That phrase, under fire, was the key. Everything that had been tried before, the manual probe and lift technique, the magnetic detector sweep, the trained dog teams, all of it worked reasonably well when no one was shooting at the engineers. None of it worked well enough when someone was. O'Brien's section began with an inventory. They collected every piece of documentation available on German mine warfare, captured manuals, after-action reports from Tunisia and Sicily, technical intelligence reports from the British who had been fighting German minefields since 1940 in North Africa. They also collected something that most histories overlook, a set of German mines themselves, both intact and in pieces, recovered from North African battlefields and shipped to Fort Belvoir for examination. Here is what they found when they started taking German mines apart. The Tellermine 42, the most common German anti-tank mine by 1943, had a pressure plate on top that required between 90 and 160 kilograms of downward force to activate. But it also had a secondary fuse socket on the side, designed to accept an anti-lift fuse, a device that would detonate the mine if someone tried to remove it from the ground. The anti-lift fuse was a standard precaution against exactly the kind of manual clearance the Americans were attempting. The Germans called these Sicherungsvorrichtungen, security devices. They were fitted to somewhere between 20 and 40% of all Teller mines laid in defensive positions by late 1943. The S-mine, the Bouncing Betty in American soldier slang, was even more complex. When triggered by a tripwire or a pressure fuse, a small propellant charge fired the main mine body upward to a height of between 60 and 120 centimeters before the main fragmentation charge detonated. The fragmentation spread horizontally in a 360-degree pattern, lethal to unprotected infantry within approximately 22 meters. Attempting to disarm an S-mine manually required locating the tripwires first, which were often invisible in grass or undergrowth, and then approaching the mine from a specific angle to access the fuse without triggering it. In Tunisia, engineers who attempted this under fire had a documented survival rate that O'Brien's section described in one report as not acceptable for planning purposes. That is a remarkable phrase. Not acceptable for planning purposes. It means we cannot build a doctrine on the assumption that men will survive this. O'Brien's section catalogued 23 distinct German mine types used in the European theater by early 1944. Of those 23, 16 had anti-lift or anti-tamper features of some kind. 12 had been specifically modified to defeat the AN/PRS-1 mine detector, the standard American magnetic detector, either by using wooden or glass casings or by reducing the metal content to below the detector's sensitivity threshold. Stop and think about that. The Germans were not just laying mines. They were laying mines specifically designed to defeat the American clearance method. They were, in effect, solving the same problem from the other side. This is the moment O'Brien's section made the intellectual pivot that changed everything. If the Germans had designed their mines to defeat manual clearance and magnetic detection, then manual clearance and magnetic detection were fighting the last war. The new approach had to start somewhere else entirely. It had to start not with how to find mines, but with how mines worked. Specifically, with what made them go off. Meet Sergeant First Class Theodore Kuhn, 28 years old. From Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where he had worked as a machinist at the Kohler Company making plumbing fixtures. He had an unusually precise understanding of mechanical tolerances, of how much force a given mechanism required to operate, and of what happened when you applied force in unexpected directions. He had been assigned to O'Brien's section as a technical specialist In late 1943, after a stint with the 2nd Engineer Combat Battalion in Sicily, where he had personally disarmed, by the battalion's records, 47 mines in a single 6-day clearance operation. The battalion commander had written in his evaluation that Kuhn had an almost reckless willingness to experiment with enemy ordnance. That willingness was about to become a doctrine. Kuhn's insight, documented in a technical report dated February of 1944, stamped secret and now declassified in the National Archives, was simple. German anti-tank mines were designed to detonate under the weight of a vehicle. They were not designed to resist lateral shock. The pressure plate mechanism functioned by downward compression. It was not particularly sensitive to horizontal force, vibration, or the kind of ground-transmitted shock wave that a nearby explosion would produce. But there was a threshold, and if you could find that threshold, you could potentially use it. Kuhn's report proposed a series of controlled experiments to determine whether a nearby explosion, specifically a shaped charge or a length of detonating cord, could produce sufficient ground shock to initiate the pressure fuse of a buried teller mine from a distance. The concept was not entirely new. British engineers had experimented with something similar in North Africa. But the British approach had been to use large explosive charges that destroyed everything in a wide area. Effective, but wasteful of explosives and impossible to use near friendly positions. What Kuhn proposed was more precise. A systematic study of the minimum charge required, the optimal placement, and the standoff distance needed to initiate a mine sympathetically without destroying the breaching team in the process. O'Brien approved the experiments in February of 1944. They began at Fort Belvoir's engineer test area in March. The results would take 4 months to fully develop into operational doctrine. But the first results, available within weeks, were startling enough that O'Brien forwarded them immediately to the European Theatre of Operations headquarters in London. The subject line of his forwarding memo, as recorded in the archive, read, "Preliminary data on sympathetic detonation of AT mines. Potential for field application." Potential. That word was doing a lot of work. Part 3. What happens when you pull the thread? The experiments at Fort Belvoir in March and April of 1944 were methodical in a way that combat operations rarely are. O'Brien's section had access to a test range, a supply of captured German mines, and, crucially, enough time to fail repeatedly without anyone dying. The basic setup was this: a captured Teller Mine 42, buried at the standard German depth of 5 to 8 centimeters below surface, in soil conditions approximating the sandy loam of coastal France. A charge of varying size and composition, placed at varying distances and depths alongside or above the mine. A measurement of whether the mine detonated sympathetically from the shock wave, or did not. The first experiments used quarter-pound blocks of TNT placed directly on the surface above the mine. At distances of up to 30 centimeters, the surface charge reliably initiated the Teller Mine. At distances of 60 centimeters, initiation occurred roughly 40% of the time. At 1 meter, almost never. This was not yet useful. You cannot place a charge 30 centimeters above a mine you haven't found yet. The breakthrough came when Kuhn shifted the geometry. Instead of placing charges above individual mines, he proposed running a continuous line of detonating cord, primacord in American supply terminology, a flexible explosive cord with a detonation velocity of approximately 6,400 meters per second, along the surface of the minefield, at a fixed distance from the edge. The cord itself contained a small amount of PETN explosive distributed along its length. When detonated from one end, the explosive wave traveled the length of the cord in a fraction of a second, producing a continuous ground shock along the entire line. The question was whether this linear ground shock could initiate mines that the cord passed over or near without the engineer team needing to know where the mines were? The answer, as documented in O'Brien's test report of April 19, 1944, was yes, with qualifications. A single strand of primacord, 1/4 inch diameter, laid along the surface of a minefield and detonated, initiated between 40 and 60% of Tellermine 42s buried within 30 centimeters of the cord's path. At 60 centimeters, the initiation rate dropped to between 15 and 25%. At 1 meter, essentially zero. Those numbers sound modest, but here is what they mean in practice. Stop and think about this carefully. A German anti-tank minefield was typically laid in a pattern of parallel rows, with mines spaced at intervals of between 1 and 3 meters, in rows separated by 1 to 2 meters. If you ran a strand of primacord down each row at a spacing of 60 centimeters, you would expect to initiate somewhere between 40 and 60% of all mines in the field on the first pass. The remaining mines, those not initiated on the first pass, were now known quantities. Their positions were revealed by the craters and disturbed earth left by the mines that had detonated. A second pass, with the cord placed more precisely relative to the surviving mines, would initiate a substantial portion of the remainder. You had not found the minefield. You had not mapped it. You had made it destroy itself, partially, using the energy of its own explosive charges to reveal the positions of the mines that survived. And here is the key detail that makes the whole thing work militarily. The engineer team doing this never entered the minefield. They lay at the edge, they fired a line of primacord across it from a distance, and they observed the results from cover. The German anti-lift fuses, those Sicherungsvorrichtungen that made manual clearance so lethal, were irrelevant. An anti-lift fuse prevents someone from picking up a mine. It does not prevent the mine from detonating in place when the ground shock reaches it. In fact, in some configurations, the anti-lift fuse made the mine more sensitive to sympathetic detonation because it added a second initiating mechanism. The Germans had built a system to defeat manual clearance. The engineers had found a way to turn that system against itself. This is the moment where O'Brien's forwarding memo to London stopped being a preliminary data report and started being something more urgent. He sent a follow-up memo on May 2, 1944, 36 days before D-Day, requesting permission to deploy a forward technical team to England to brief theater engineers on the findings and to begin adapting the technique for field use. The request was approved. But there was a problem. Primacord in the quantities needed for systematic minefield clearance was not in the supply pipeline for the invasion. The standard combat engineer load for D-Day did not include it as a breaching tool. Getting it into the logistics chain in time required a set of decisions at the theater level that, frankly, did not happen quickly enough. The first waves of engineers going ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, were using the same manual probe and lift technique that had produced 31% casualties in Tunisia. The doctrine existed, the technique worked, the supply chain had not caught up. That gap between what the engineers knew and what they had in their hands cost lives on the beaches. If you are looking for a forensic lesson in military logistics, here it is. The best technique in the world is worth nothing if it is not in the hands of the men who need it at the moment they need it. The men and women who kept records of what happened on those beaches, the engineers who went in with the first waves, deserve to be named. One of them was Staff Sergeant Frank DeLuca, 26 years old, from Trenton, New Jersey, where he had worked as a plumber's assistant before the war. He was assigned to the 237th Engineer Combat Battalion, which landed at Omaha Beach in the second wave on June 6th. His battalion's mission was to clear 16 vehicle lanes through the beach obstacles and minefields in the first 30 minutes after landing. They cleared 3. DeLuca's account given in a debriefing recorded by the First Army's Engineer Section and now held at the National Archives, is precise and without self-pity. His team landed under fire, lost 2 men in the water before reaching the beach, and began probing for mines with bayonets in the wet sand at the waterline. The tide was coming in. The German fire was direct and accurate. They found mines. They marked them with white tape. They could not lift them because the sand was too wet and the anti-lift fuses were present. They cleared a path approximately 1 meter wide and 40 meters long in 90 minutes, during which 3 more men in his section were wounded. "We needed the cord," De Luca said in his debriefing. "We all knew about the cord. We didn't have the cord." The cord was primacord. He had been briefed on the Fort Belvoir experiments. He understood exactly what the technique could do. He did not have the supplies to use it. This is the single most important sentence in the entire documentary record of American mine warfare in Normandy. We all knew about the cord. We didn't have the cord. If you want to understand how military technology actually reaches the battlefield, not in the clean institutional narrative where doctrine flows from experiment to training to deployment, but in the real, jagged, supply chain-dependent reality, that sentence is your text. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The story of American mine warfare development between 1943 and 1945 is not a story of brilliant invention. It is not a story of a single genius in a laboratory who solved the problem and won the war. It is a story about a specific kind of institutional learning, slow, expensive in lives, imperfect in execution, and about the gap that almost always exists between what an army knows and what it can do. The technique that O'Brien's section developed, sympathetic detonation of German minefields using primacord, was not, in its basic physics, mysterious. The Germans knew about sympathetic detonation. They had designed their minefields to account for it, in certain configurations, and their placement standards included minimum spacing between mines, partly to prevent one detonation from initiating adjacent mines in an uncontrolled chain. What O'Brien's section discovered was not a secret of physics. It was a systematic exploitation of the gap between what the Germans had designed their mines to resist and what they had not. The German anti-tank mine was designed to resist manual lifting. It was designed to resist magnetic detection. It was not designed, because its designers had not conceived of the threat, to resist a sustained linear ground shock from a long continuous explosive cord laid along its row spacing at precisely the standoff distance that maximized initiation probability without requiring precise mine location. That gap between what a weapon is designed to defeat and what it is not is where engineering intelligence lives. Let's be precise about the operational record. After the supply chain failure of D-Day, primacord-based breaching entered the standard combat engineer kit in the European Theater of Operations by late July of 1944, during the Cobra breakout operation. The First Army's after-action report for Operation Cobra, covering the period from July 25th to August 1st, documents the use of what it calls explosive line charges in the clearance of at least 9 confirmed German anti-tank minefields south of Saint-Lô. In those 9 operations, the engineer sections using primacord-based techniques reported a combined total of 4 killed and 11 wounded. 9 minefields, 4 dead. Compare that to Tunisia. Compare it to Omaha Beach. The technique was not perfect. The 40 to 60% first pass initiation rate meant that surviving mines required follow-up clearance, and that clearance still required manual work, still carried risk. But the nature of the risk had changed fundamentally. Instead of entering an unknown minefield and probing for mines that might be anywhere, engineers were entering a partially detonated field where the surviving mines had been partially revealed by the craters around them, and where the density of undetonated mines had been reduced by more than half. The psychological difference was as significant as the tactical one. Engineers who had watched a primacord line go down a minefield and seen a sequence of detonations walk across the field in a line, who had watched the minefield, in effect, eat itself, approached the follow-up clearance with a fundamentally different orientation than men going into an untouched field. They had evidence. They had data. They had seen what the field contained and where the concentrations were. This matters because fear is itself a casualty-producing factor. Men who are paralyzed by the unknown take longer to complete a task, make more errors, and require more supervision. Men who have watched the field partially destroy itself are operating with a narrower uncertainty band. The cognitive load is lower. The task is still dangerous, but it is not the same kind of dangerous. Now, the other side of this ledger. The things that did not work or did not work as planned. The shoe mine remained a serious problem throughout the campaign. The shoe mine, Schutzen Mine 42, to use its full designation, was a wooden-framed anti-personnel device roughly the size and shape of a small cigar box, containing approximately 200 grams of TNT. It weighed just over 1 kilogram. It had almost no metal content. It was essentially undetectable by magnetic means and nearly invisible to visual inspection in undergrowth. It required between 9 and 15 kilograms of pressure to detonate, well within the range of a man's footstep. The primacord technique was less effective against shoe mines than against teller mines. The wooden casing absorbed and scattered ground shock differently than the steel casing of the teller mine, and the smaller explosive charge meant that even when a shoe mine did initiate sympathetically, the resulting detonation was less likely to initiate adjacent mines in turn. In terrain where shoe mines predominated, and they did predominate in the bocage hedgerow country, where the narrow lanes and dense vegetation made anti-tank mines less useful, the engineers still had to probe. They still had to go slowly. They still died. The shoe mine problem was not solved by the sympathetic detonation technique. It was partially mitigated by improved probe designs, by the development of better protective footwear, a reinforced boot sole that could, in some configurations, reduce the severity of a foot wound from a shoe mine detonation, and by the development of a technique using a garden hose-shaped prodder that allowed engineers to probe at a longer standoff distance and with a lower body profile. None of this was elegant. None of it was a complete solution. But by the autumn of 1944, the casualty rate among combat engineers engaged in mine clearance had dropped from the 31% per operation documented in Tunisia to somewhere between 8 and 12% per operation in the European theater. That is still a horrific number. 1 in 10 men. But it is less than 1 in 3. The reduction from 1 in 3 to 1 in 10 is the measure of what O'Brien's section accomplished. Now the biographical epilogues. Colonel John T. O'Brien remained with the Engineer Board through the end of the war. He was promoted to Brigadier General in 1945, a promotion the documentation suggests was partly driven by the operational success of his section's techniques in the European theater. After the war, he returned to civil engineering and spent the 1950s working on highway construction projects in the Pacific Northwest, a career arc that brings him back, almost perfectly, to where he started. He died in Portland, Oregon, in 1971, at the age of 69. His obituary in the Portland Oregonian mentioned his engineering work and his wartime service in a single brief paragraph. It did not mention the mine warfare experiments. Sergeant First Class Theodore Kuhn survived the war, returned to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and went back to work at the Kohler Company. He worked there for another 22 years, retiring in 1968. He gave one interview to a local newspaper in 1964, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, in which he described the Fort Belvoir experiments in general terms. The interviewer, apparently not fully grasping what Kuhn was describing, wrote a headline that read, "Local vet helped clear beaches." Kuhn, by the account of his daughter, found this mildly funny. He died in Sheboygan in 1979 at the age of 63. Staff Sergeant Frank DeLuca returned to Trenton after the war and worked as a plumbing contractor for the rest of his working life. His debriefing at First Army, the one containing the sentence, "We all knew about the cord. We didn't have the cord," was classified until 1982. He was never asked about it by any historian, as far as the record shows. He died in Trenton in 1993 at the age of 75. Second Lieutenant Roy Paget, the man standing at the edge of the hedgerow field at the opening of this investigation, survived the war, returned to Harlan County, Kentucky, and spent the next 4 decades working for the Kentucky Department of Highways as a senior surveyor. He never wrote a memoir. He gave no interviews. The record of his service exists in his unit's after-action reports, and in a single mention in a regimental history published in 1946. But here is what the record shows about what Paget's battalion accomplished in the summer and autumn of 1944, after the primacord technique reached their supply chain. The 620th Engineer Combat Battalion is documented as having cleared, in whole or in part, 22 German minefields between August of 1944 and March of 1945. In those 22 operations, the battalion suffered 7 killed and 19 wounded. That is a casualty rate of approximately 6% per operation. In Tunisia, comparable operations would have cost, at the documented 31% rate, approximately 80 men. The difference between 80 and 26 is 54 lives. Those are the lives that exist in the gap between "we knew about the cord" and "we had the cord." And now for what matters most in all of this. Not the technique, not the doctrine, not the supply chain failure on D-Day, though that failure was real and consequential and cost men their lives. What matters most is the intellectual move that O'Brien's section made in the winter of 1943 and 44. They stopped asking how to find mines. They started asking how mines worked. That is a different question. It is a harder question. It requires you to understand your enemy's engineering at a level of detail that goes beyond, "This is dangerous," and reaches into, "This is how it is dangerous, and therefore this is how it can be made to be dangerous to itself." The Germans built a system. They built it well. They built it to defeat the tools the Americans had. And they succeeded. In Tunisia, at Kasserine, on the beaches of Normandy in the first terrible hours of June 6th. The system worked. But a system that is optimized against one specific threat is, by definition, not optimized against a different threat. The Germans had designed their minefields to defeat men with probes and detectors. They had not designed them to defeat men who understood the physics of sympathetic detonation well enough to make the mines go off without touching them. When Roy Paget stood at the edge of that hedgerow field in the bocage with a primacord line in his hands instead of a probe, he was not carrying a miracle. He was carrying the product of several hundred man-hours of careful experiment, a supply chain that had finally caught up to doctrine, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of a section of combat engineers who had spent 18 months asking the right question. The field detonated in a sequence of sharp cracks and upflung dirt. Not all of it, not even most of it on the first pass, but enough. That was enough. "We all knew about the cord. We didn't have the cord," Frank DeLuca said that in 1944, in a debriefing room somewhere in France, to a First Army officer who wrote it down and stamped it secret. It took 38 years to become public record. It has never, to my knowledge, appeared in a general history of the Normandy campaign. It should be the epigraph of every study of military logistics ever written. If this investigation gave you a clearer picture of how American combat engineers actually fought the ground war in Western Europe, not the version with the dramatic beach assault and the famous generals, but the version with the machinist from Sheboygan and the plumber's assistant from Trenton and the surveyor from Harlan County, press the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer. And that matters because these men were not famous. They were just precise. And precise, in a minefield, is the only thing that keeps you alive. Roy Paget went home to Kentucky. He surveyed roads for 40 years. He never talked about the cord, but he knew what it had done. And somewhere in the records of the 620th Engineer Combat Battalion, in the dry language of after-action reports, the cord speaks for him.